The nurses called her Ghost, and Dr. Caldwell had made it a weapon. She arrived at Valley Memorial's ICU at 6:47 a.m., 17 minutes before shift change, the same as every morning for 20 years. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song overhead. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and something underneath it, something like surrender. Margaret Walsh moved through the corridor without sound, her badge clipped to her waistband, her scrubs the color of hospital walls. Invisible. That was the point. The charge nurse, Keisha, glanced up from the assignment board as Margaret clocked in. "He's already here," Keisha said quietly, meaning Dr. Caldwell. Meaning avoid the break room. Meaning the day was going to be sharp and small. Margaret didn't respond. She pulled her stethoscope from her locker, the earpieces worn smooth from 18 years of use, and tucked it into her pocket beside her trauma shears. In that same locker, behind her spare shoes, sat a pair of combat boots. Desert tan. Caked with dust from the Korengal Valley. She didn't look at them. She never did. The morning round started at 7:15 a.m. Dr. Caldwell moved through the ICU like a man who owned the place, which, according to him, he essentially did. Chief physician. 12 years in the position. Cultured voice. Expensive watch that caught the light every time he gestured, a Rolex or something close to it, something that cost more than Margaret made in 2 months. He wore his white coat like armor, perfectly pressed, his name embroidered in script across the chest. He had cultivated relationships with hospital board members the way other men cultivated gardens. Carefully. Deliberately. With an eye toward what would grow and what he would uproot. Margaret stood at the foot of room for 12, reviewing the chart for Thomas Everton, 73, post-op day from emergency abdominal repair. His vitals were stable. His wound was clean. His pain management was textbook, morphine PCA set at parameters that allowed him to maintain cognitive function while controlling the ischemic pain radiating through his lower abdomen. She'd been monitoring him personally since admission, adjusting the protocol as his body responded, the way you adjusted sails to shifting wind. It was work that took precision. Work that no one noticed. Ghost, Dr. Caldwell said, using the nickname like punctuation. He hadn't invented it, the staff had. But he'd weaponized it, deployed it during rounds where the young residents could hear, where it landed like a small permission to dismiss her. Ghost can take the overflow in bed 7. She doesn't have anywhere important to be. The young resident, a woman named Chen, laughed. Something small and nervous. She was new enough to still believe in hierarchy, in the natural order of things. At least she's quiet, another physician added, Dr. Marcus, his name tag reading internal medicine. Easier to ignore. He meant it as a compliment. Margaret knew the difference. Compliments that praised silence were always weapons. She didn't look up from Thomas Everton's chart. Her hands didn't move. Her breathing remained steady, the kind of calm that came from a decade and a half of watching men like Caldwell move through the world, believing their own importance so completely that they mistook her invisibility for weakness. It wasn't weakness. It was strategy. When they moved to the next room, Margaret stayed with Thomas Everton. She pressed her palm against the foresight near his wrist, warm, no redness, no sign of infection. She checked the monitor readings, heart rate 74, blood pressure 118/76, O2 sat 97% on room air. She adjusted his morphine PCA slightly, reducing the dose by 0.5 milligrams per hour because his pupils were growing sluggish, because she could read his body the way other people read books, and his body was telling her he was in control now, healing, that the pain was becoming information instead of crisis. "How are you feeling?" she asked him. Her voice was different when no one else was listening. Quieter. More like it actually belonged to her. "Better," Thomas said. His eyes were clearer now than they'd been yesterday. "You're the one who comes at night, aren't you? I remember you checking on me around 3 a.m. "That's right. You remember things," he said. "About what I like. How I sleep better on my left side. The way I told you my daughter was getting married and you asked me what color her dress was. His voice was soft with something like gratitude, something like recognition. The other doctors, they look at the monitors. You look at me. Margaret held the moment. She didn't smile. Smiling would have felt like admitting something. I'll be here again tonight. What she didn't tell him was that Dr. Caldwell had begun reassigning her long-term patients without notice. She'd arrived 3 days ago to find Thomas Everton's chart marked with a new name in the provider line. She'd gone directly to Caldwell and said, "I'm his nurse." He'd looked at her like she'd spoken a language he didn't recognize and said, "Not anymore." He needs someone with more clinical authority. Caldwell had chosen to ignore, that Margaret had 17 years of bedside experience to his 14 years in administration, that she'd kept Thomas Everton alive through 3 sepsis scares that the monitors almost missed, that the intimacy of continuity of care was not a luxury but a form of medicine itself. She'd begun the handoff anyway, briefing the new nurse on everything Thomas Everton needed. Not because Caldwell had ordered it. Because that's what you did. You handed off your patients like you were passing a living thing, and you made sure the person holding it knew how to keep it alive. The break room at 8:30 a.m. was where Margaret learned the full architecture of her isolation. She was reaching for coffee, the machine gurgling with its terrible, endless sound, when she heard her own name used in past tense. "Nobody wants to be assigned with Ghost anymore," a nurse named Riley was saying. Riley was young, maybe 4 years in, still figuring out which alliances would keep her safe. Caldwell basically hung a sign on her that says, "Do not collaborate." One of the respiratory therapists told me he asked Caldwell point blank why he kept reassigning Margaret's patients, and Caldwell said, "Because she undermines my authority. She makes decisions without waiting for confirmation." "That's not true," another voice said. Keisha, the charge nurse. Keisha, who had seniority and could afford a small amount of defiance. "Margaret, some of the best clinical instinct I've seen in 20 years. She catches things before they show on the monitors." "Doesn't matter," Riley said. "He's convinced people that she's a problem." I heard 2 of the interns talking. One of them said he'd actually be worried being assigned to a code if Margaret was leading it. Riley paused. He said it like it was a bad thing. Margaret heard the fear underneath it. The young woman was trying to stay safe by staying aligned with power. Margaret understood. Alignment was survival. She'd learned that in Korengal. The coffee was black and bitter. Margaret held the cup like it was a thing requiring her full attention. She was still in that break room, still holding that cup, when the image arrived uninvited, a child's face. Dust. The collapse happening in real time, the sound of concrete breaking like bones, a boy maybe 6 years old, maybe 7, screaming his sister's name into the rubble. Margaret had pulled him out. Had carried him 847 meters across terrain that was actively trying to kill them both, her hands underneath his arms, his small body shaking like something breakable, his eyes finding hers in the darkness of the transport helicopter and holding them, like she was the thing keeping him tethered to life. She'd never seen him again. Medical discharge came 3 months later. She'd walked out of that life like it was a room she'd left behind. Locked the door. Put on scrubs. Became invisible. Margaret set the coffee cup down. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The memory folded itself away with all the others. When the shift bell rang at 9 a.m., a sound like the emergency intercom but different, a summoning, Margaret was already moving toward room for 14. A patient named Diane had arrived 3 days ago, diabetic, post-op from a femur fracture repair, her glucose levels swinging like a pendulum because Caldwell had ordered insulin dosing that didn't account for her specific metabolic history or the anti-inflammatory drugs she was taking. The protocol was technically within standard ranges. It was also wrong. Margaret had documented it twice. Caldwell had ignored both notes. She entered the room quietly and began checking Diane's vitals. Blood pressure 127/81. Heart rate 89. O2 sat 98%. The monitors were telling the clinical story. But Margaret moved closer, pressed the back of her hand against Diane's forehead, warm, maybe fever, then checked her peripheral circulation by pressing a fingernail bed and watching the color return. Slow. Slower than yesterday. How are you feeling? Margaret asked. Honestly? Confused, Diane said. My blood sugar was 340 this morning. I've never had readings like that. But the doctor keeps saying it's normal for post-op patients. It wasn't normal. Not at these rates. Not with her history. Margaret pulled up the lab values on the monitor. Glucose trending upward. Keton levels beginning to climb. Lipase elevated. Early signs of something building underneath the surface, something that the monitors would scream about in 12, maybe 18 hours, when it became crisis instead of just pattern. She adjusted the insulin protocol in Diane's chart, reducing the dose and adding a note with specific clinical reasoning, metabolic factors, concurrent medications, individual variants from standard dosing. She didn't include her opinion. She included only the data. The numbers. The things Caldwell couldn't argue with unless he wanted to argue with mathematics itself. The intercom crackled at 11:04 a.m. The sound cut through the entire ICU like something sharp. Incoming Level 1 trauma. Military transport. Cardiac complications. ETA 12 minutes. Margaret's hand stilled. The coffee cup she'd been carrying to the sink paused mid-motion. Around her, the ICU began its transformation, the choreography of crisis, nurses moving with sudden purpose, beds being prepped, the quiet morning becoming something taut and electric. Ghost, Caldwell's voice cut through the activity. He appeared in the hallway, his white coat moving like he was walking through water that only he could feel. You're taking intake. Try not to mess this one up. Military means paperwork, and paperwork means oversight. I'm sure you understand. Margaret understood. She understood that he was telling her not to fail because failure with this patient would be visible in ways that failure with other patients wasn't. She understood that military transport meant official records, meant someone would check on how the patient was treated, meant that any mistake would leave a trace. She understood that he was terrified of her. Not consciously. Not in a way he could articulate. But it was there underneath the dismissal, underneath the careful construction of her invisibility. The terrified certainty that someone in this hospital, someone moving like a ghost through his corridors, was better than he was, and that eventually, someone would notice. Margaret set the coffee cup down on the nearest counter and moved toward Trauma Bay 1. 12 minutes. The preamble was ending. The story was about to arrive. Room for 47 smelled like antiseptic and fear. Mr. Chen sat propped on 3 pillows, his wife holding his hand while their daughter stood near the window, anxiety etched into her jaw. Margaret had managed his post-operative pain for 8 months, adjusted his dosing when the neuropathy worsened, stayed late to monitor his response to the medications, earned the kind of trust that came from listening. His pain scores had dropped from 8 to 3. He was sleeping through the night for the first time since surgery. Dr. Caldwell arrived during rounds with the cardiothoracic surgical team trailing behind him like satellites orbiting a dying star. He didn't knock. He stepped into the room with the kind of territorial confidence that made the air pressure change, and Margaret immediately registered the calculation in his eyes, the Chen family present, the daughter with her phone down, the vulnerability of a moment he could weaponize. We're discontinuing Nurse Walsh's protocol, Caldwell announced, pulling the chart from the foot of the bed without reading it. His voice carried the particular edge of someone who had already written the narrative. It's dangerously incompetent and frankly, could have killed you, Mr. Chen. Margaret stood motionless. She didn't flinch. Her hands remained steady at her sides. Nurses sometimes forget their limitations, Caldwell continued, his gaze never leaving Mr. Chen's face, deliberately excluding her from the conversation. They see 1 month of improvement and believe they've discovered medicine. They haven't. They've just gotten lucky. He turned to the surgical resident. What's the current standard of care for post-thoracotomy neuropathic pain? The resident recited the textbook protocol, the same one Margaret had followed for 8 months while documenting every deviation and the clinical outcome. Caldwell smiled at his own confirmation. Exactly. Thank you, Nurse Walsh, for your efforts, but we'll be moving Mr. Chen to the established protocol immediately. His pain levels will likely increase initially, but that's the cost of evidence-based practice. Margaret watched Mr. Chen's face crumple. She watched his wife's hand tighten. She watched Caldwell turn toward the door, his performance complete. The room went silent. 3 seconds of it. The fluorescent panel above hummed its thin, endless note. Your insecurity is showing, Doctor, Margaret said. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped instead, fell into the lower register of someone who had given orders that shaped life and death. You might want to get that checked. She turned and walked past him, her posture unchanged, her jaw set like flint. Behind her, Caldwell's sputtering sounded like an engine that wouldn't turn over. Excuse me? That's completely inappropriate, but she was already in the corridor, the door closing behind her, her footsteps audible and unhurried while he remained in the room, diminished, his authority suddenly as fragile as it actually was. 20 minutes later, Margaret sat in the break room with her sandwich untouched on the table in front of her. The room had been full when she arrived, Sandra at the small refrigerator, James reading something on his phone, 2 nurses discussing a patient update. Within 6 seconds of her sitting down, Sandra's expression changed. Something flickered across her face, fear, maybe, or calculation. She grabbed her bag. Oh, I just remembered I need to check on. She didn't finish. She just left. James suddenly had phone calls. Urgent ones, apparently, because he stood and walked toward the corridor with his phone already pressed to his ear. One of the other nurses said something about needing to restock the supply cart. Within 2 minutes, Margaret sat alone with her cooling coffee and her untouched sandwich. The silence in the break room felt purposeful, like the silence before a storm. She understood then what she had done. Not to Caldwell, to herself. The defiance had a cost, and the cost was this: isolation. Erasure. The kind of systematic abandonment that preceded something worse. The next morning, her name appeared on the public disciplinary board in the main corridor outside the unit office. The board was designed for patient safety notifications and protocol updates, but someone had printed her name and posted it like an announcement: Walsh, M., failure to follow chain of command. Written warning issued. The words felt like a physical blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they were official. They were permanent. They were a record. 3 patients she'd managed for years were reassigned by noon. No explanations. No transition periods. She arrived for her afternoon assignment and found their rooms occupied by other nurses, their charts already updated, the continuity of care she had built methodically dismantled. Mrs. Kowalski, who had trusted her with the management of her husband's post-ICU anxiety. Tom Hernandez, whose infection markers Margaret had caught before they escalated. The Okafor family, who had specifically requested her during their infant's recovery. Gone. Redistributed. Their loyalty redefined as a problem that needed solving. During afternoon rounds, Caldwell made his move in front of the entire surgical team. A post-op infection was developing in a patient Margaret had flagged twice in her charting, 2 documented notes suggesting early signs of an ascending fever pattern. Caldwell stood at the bedside, reviewing the chart with the kind of careful attention he had never directed toward her observations before. Ghost here thinks she can diagnose what 5 doctors missed, he said to the team, using the nickname he had started days ago, the one designed to suggest she was a phantom, a whisper of expertise rather than a presence. Adorable, really. The infection isn't developing. The patient is post-operative. Temperature spikes are normal. Nurse Walsh would have us running sepsis protocols on every surgical patient who runs a fever. A medical student snickered. Exactly as Caldwell had designed the moment to unfold. Margaret made no notes in the patient's chart. No documentation of his dismissal. No record of her clinical concern. To document it now would appear retaliatory, and Caldwell had positioned himself so perfectly that anything she said would be interpreted as defending herself rather than protecting the patient. She had learned, over 20 years of walking these corridors, that there were fights you couldn't win. There were only fights you could endure. That evening, she found her ICU assignment posted on the night shift schedule. The name on the chart made her breath stop. She didn't react visibly. Her hands remained steady. Her expression didn't change. But the recognition hit her with the force of a decompression chamber opening too fast. Reeves, James. Captain, Special Forces. Cardiac trauma with retained shrapnel. The face in the chart photo was wrong. This man was 32 years old, decorated, his jaw hardened by a decade of operations. But underneath the years and the rank and the accumulated violence of his career, Margaret saw the 8-year-old boy she had pulled from a collapsed building in the Korengal Valley, his mother dead, his younger sister trapped in the concrete above him, her screams filtering through the rubble while Margaret dug with hands that had stopped being gentle the moment the IED detonated. She had carried him through sniper fire to the field hospital 2 kilometers away. He'd had shrapnel embedded from his left collarbone to his ribs, fragments she couldn't remove without equipment they didn't have, so she'd cleaned the wounds, managed his pain with whatever pharmacology they had, held him while he screamed for a mother who wasn't coming back. He'd been labeled expectant. Likely to die. She'd kept him alive anyway through pure refusal to accept the mathematics of trauma. Now his chart showed the shrapnel was still there. Still migrating. Fragments moving toward his pericardium, the membrane surrounding his heart. The same fragments she'd extracted from her memory 1,000 times, imagining what she would have done differently with a full surgical suite and a trauma team instead of a field tent and a depleted supply cache. She checked his vital signs without anyone watching. Her pulse remained steady. Her hands remained steady. The trembling, if it came, would happen in private. Not here. Not now. Not while Caldwell was still drawing breath in the same building. The ICU was a cathedral of monitors and fluorescent hum, the night shift skeleton crew moving like ghosts through the corridors of Valley Memorial. Margaret pushed through the double doors at 11:47 p.m., her badge clipped to scrubs that had been washed so many times the fabric felt like cotton skin against her ribs. The charge nurse handed her the assignment sheet without looking up. 3 patients. Routine. Stable. She scanned the names and stopped breathing. Captain James Reeves. Room for 12. The chart felt heavier than paper should weigh. She pulled it from the rack and her eyes found the photograph clipped to the intake form, a man in dress uniform, desert tan with medals arranged in precise rows, jaw set hard as granite, eyes carrying the particular flatness that came from having seen things most people would never survive. But it was the shape of the face that caught her. The bone structure. The slight scar on his left cheekbone, silvery and thin, running from temple to jaw. She knew that scar. 20 years dissolved in the space between one breath and the next. Kandahar. No, Korengal. A village that didn't exist on any official map, where a building came down at 4:17 in the morning, and Margaret, then a newly promoted captain with the 75th Ranger Regiment's attached combat medic team, pulled a child from the rubble with his left arm hanging by tendons and blood running down his face so thick she couldn't see his eyes. He was screaming in Pashto, calling for Mada, for mother, the universal word for the person who should have been there instead of the woman with the bandages and the foreign hands pressing gauze into his shoulder. She remembered his name because you remember the names of the ones you pull from the dead. James Reeves. 8 years old. Newly orphaned by the same blast that took his arm's mobility and left a scar that would follow him into adulthood. And now he was on her ward. A captain. Special Forces. The shrapnel she once tended in a field hospital, the migrating piece of metal they discussed marking him for life, was now compressing his heart. Margaret's hands moved without her permission, pulling his medical history from the electronic system. Shrapnel fragment, 1.8 centimeters, lodged in the anterior pericardium. Migrating eastward over the past 6 months. Cardiothoracic surgery scheduled for next week. Patient stable for now, but the note said it clearly: 1 wrong movement, 1 hour of exertion, and the shard would compress the pericardial sac and choke his heart into arrest. She was standing at the nursing station when it happened. 11:59 p.m. The monitor in room for 12 began the sound that meant death. Not the flatline whistle, worse than that. The rhythm that meant his cardiac output was collapsing, the electrical signal present but the mechanical pump failing. The alarm shrieked like something alive and hurt. Margaret moved. The other night shift nurse, a woman named Chin who'd learned early not to make eye contact with Margaret, was already dialing. "I'm calling the attending, calling cardiothoracic, they're in surgery but..." "How long?" "ETA on the surgical team is 40 minutes, maybe more, the attending is..." "Calling Dr. Caldwell." 3 times. No answer. 40 minutes. The sound the monitor was making said Reeves had maybe 8. The migrating shrapnel had shifted. It was compressing his pericardium. His heart was drowning in its own blood, unable to pump. Every second his oxygen saturation was dropping. The monitors showed it in real time. 92, 88, 84, falling. Margaret was already moving toward his room, her hands reaching for the crash cart without conscious decision, muscle memory taking over. 22 years of training in emergency rooms and field hospitals from Fort Hood to Kandahar had written this protocol into her nervous system so deeply that thinking about it would only slow her down. She reached his bedside. His eyes were open, terrified, the same eyes from 20 years ago looking at her from a face that had become a man's while she wasn't watching. "Captain," she said, her voice dropping into the register she had and used in civilian space, the one that meant absolute authority. "You have cardiac tamponade. I'm going to fix it. Don't move." He tried to speak. She was already prepping the kit. Charge Nurse Chin appeared in the doorway. "Margaret, you can't, you don't have authority," Caldwell said. "Document this." Margaret's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I paged Dr. Caldwell 3 times. No response. Patient is coding. On-call cardiothoracic team is unavailable. I am proceeding with emergency pericardiocentesis under combat medical authority, combat medical protocols, field hospital standard of care." Write down every word. The subxiphoid approach. Below the sternum, angling toward the left shoulder. She'd done this in a tent in Kandahar with sand blowing through the ventilation, with incoming fire making the canvas wall shudder. She'd done it with a child who screamed and with a 23-year-old sergeant who didn't. This was the same. The anatomy didn't change. The physics didn't change. The gravity of metal and blood and the small space between life and something worse remained constant. The 14-gauge needle slid in with the particular resistance of tissue. She advanced it slowly, carefully, feeling for the give that meant she'd entered the pericardial space. There. A subtle change in pressure. A shift in the way the needle moved through layers. She aspirated. Dark blood filled the syringe. Nearly black. Old blood. The fluid that had been compressing his heart, stealing his electrical impulses the ability to translate into heartbeats. She evacuated 120 cubic centimeters in 90 seconds. The monitors changed mid-draw. His blood pressure came up. The rhythm stabilized. The oxygen saturation climbed, 84. 86, 89. 92. The mechanical heart pump reasserted itself because the physical obstacle was gone. Electromagnetic signal met mechanical capability again and they synchronized. Sinus rhythm. Margaret disposed of the needle in the sharps container with the same methodical care she used for everything, sharp movements, no wasted motion, precision that looked like calm to anyone watching. Her hands weren't shaking. Her breathing was even. Her voice, when she spoke to Charge Nurse Chin, carried the particular timbre of someone who had already survived the worst thing that could happen today. Document that we've withdrawn 120 ccs of bloody fluid from the pericardial space, vital signs stabilized post-procedure, patient is responsive and breathing spontaneously. I'll stay with him. You call cardiothoracic again and tell them the tamponade has been relieved but the shrapnel is still present. They need to know what they're walking into when they eventually get down here. Chin was pale, her clipboard trembling slightly in her hands. Margaret, Dr. Caldwell is going to. I know what he's going to do. Margaret was checking Reeves' pupils now, her penlight steady as a surgical laser. Do your job. I'll do mine. What she didn't say, she was already calculating the cost. Caldwell would arrive. He would see a procedure performed without his authorization. He would see a patient alive who should, according to protocol, have been waiting for the surgical team in cardiac arrest. And he would see that Margaret Walsh, the nurse he'd been systematically erasing from the hospital's consciousness for the past 3 months, had done something he couldn't undo. She didn't have to wait long. Dr. Caldwell burst through the ICU doors at 12:14 a.m., still in the street clothes he'd been wearing when he ignored 3 pages, still carrying the momentum of having been called out of somewhere important. His eyes went to room for 12. He stepped inside and his gaze moved from the monitor, showing stable rhythm, steady vital signs, to Margaret, who was standing at the bedside with a used needle in the sharps container and documentation already entered into the system. His face went white. Then red. Then a shade of purple that suggested his blood pressure was doing something concerning. His voice, when it came, was quiet in a way that was far more dangerous than shouting. What did you do? Margaret handed him the documentation printout, her eyes meeting his for exactly 1 second before looking back at her patient. Saved his life. You're welcome to write it up however you want. Caldwell's hand went to his phone before she finished the sentence. He walked into the hallway, and she heard his voice begin, clipped and urgent, making the calls that would set everything in motion. She heard fragments, "We have a serious problem." Complete violation of protocol. She performed an invasive procedure without authorization. I don't care if it's midnight, they need to know this now. By 6:47 a.m., when Margaret finished her shift and walked out of Valley Memorial carrying a cardboard box with her stethoscope rattling inside it like a ghost in a tin can, Dr. Caldwell had activated a network that had taken him 15 years to cultivate. He'd called for board members by name. He'd requested Margaret's complete personnel file from her nursing school and her 3 previous employers. He'd contacted the Texas Medical Board and requested an emergency review of her credentials. He'd summoned a state medical investigator who would arrive before noon, clipboard in hand, with questions that no civilian nurse should be able to answer. He'd done everything except the one thing that mattered. He hadn't saved the patient's life. The monitor screamed. 2 rhythms at once, the ventilator's mechanical whoosh and underneath it, the flatline's ascending whine. Margaret didn't hear the second one anymore. Muscle memory had already taken over. She moved toward the bedside with the kind of economy that comes from having done this in caves in Kandahar, in forward operating bases where the lights ran on generators and the windows were sandbags. Reeves' chest heaved against the ventilator. His pressure was 62/38. Falling. The right atrium was drowning in its own fluid, the pericardium filling faster than his heart could pump against it. Tamponade. The worst kind of trap, your own body becomes the weapon. I need a 14-gauge needle. Long dwell catheter. 32 mm. Her voice was level, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. The nurse at the monitor froze. Did I stutter, petty officer? The habit was muscle memory. The rank structure. The command voice that belonged to someone who had made decisions that kept 12 people alive or got them sent home in flag-draped boxes. The nurse moved. Margaret's hands assembled the kit without hesitation. Prep solution. Local anesthetic. She found the 5th intercostal space, the xiphoid process, the angle that would slide the needle between ribs without catching bone. 20 years of civilian medicine had not erased what her hands knew. The field hospitals of Korengal had burned themselves into her palms. This was the same procedure she had performed on a Marine sergeant with shrapnel in his chest, the same angle, the same pressure, the same knowledge that speed was the only mercy. She felt rather than saw the needle enter the pericardium. The give. The subtle resistance that meant she was inside the sac surrounding his heart. 60-milliliter syringe. Her hand opened before she asked. Someone had already prepared it. The negative pressure. The pull. And then the hiss of air escaping, that sound that meant the trap was springing open, the pressure releasing, the heart remembering how to beat against normal resistance. Blood flowed into the syringe. Dark red. 50 milliliters. 60. The monitor's rhythm suddenly tightened, sharpened. Sinus rhythm. 84 beats per minute. His oxygen saturation climbed. 76, 82. 88. The numbers were climbing the way her own heart had when she pulled that 8-year-old out of Korengal rubble 20 years ago, telling him, "You're going to be fine, soldier. You're going to grow up. I promise." Ree's eyes opened. For one fraction of a second, his gaze found hers across the ICU. Recognition flickered. Memory. He saw Valkyrie in the eyes of the woman in the surgical mask. His lips moved, but the ventilator wouldn't let him speak. She placed her gloved hand on his forehead, a gesture that belonged to no protocol, no hospital policy. A gesture that belonged to the mountains. "You're stable," she whispered. "Stay with me, Captain." The needle was disposed of in sharps without ceremony. The 4 was running. The monitors showed what they should show: a patient saved, a crisis averted, 90 seconds from flatline to stability. Margaret was documenting vitals when the ICU doors hissed open. Dr. Caldwell entered. His eyes moved from Margaret to Reeves to the cardiac monitor, and she watched his face do the calculation: patient alive, Margaret's hand steady, the impossible made routine. She didn't look away. She didn't move. But that wasn't the worst part. His phone was already in his hand before she saw him turn toward the hallway. She heard the murmur of voices. One call became 2. 2 became a chain, the kind of cascade that only happens when someone activates a network that has been waiting years to be used. Board members he'd cultivated at golf clubs. Medical directors at other hospitals where Margaret had worked, where the files might be tilted if properly questioned. State medical investigators, their numbers at his fingertips. By 6:47 a.m., while Reeves was being transferred to CCU, Dr. Caldwell had built a structure designed to collapse her entirely. By 7:15 a.m., the board chairman had received his call. By 8:15 a.m., Dr. Caldwell appeared in the ICU corridor where Margaret was writing Reeves' post-procedure notes. His voice carried the kind of volume that was meant to carry, through 3 units, through the entire hospital, past every nurse and doctor and visitor who might be listening. "Major Walsh, you are terminated, effective immediately. Gross violation of protocol. Practicing medicine beyond scope. Endangering a patient." He didn't say her rank with respect. He spat it. "You performed a procedure without authorization, without consultation, without even notifying the on-call physician. You're done. Security will escort you out of this building." The termination letter was on hospital letterhead, the words already printed before this conversation happened. He handed it to her like a man who had already prepared his victory. Margaret took it. She didn't speak. She didn't argue. She didn't tremble or burn red or retreat. She simply read the words and folded the paper once. She walked to her locker. The same locker where she'd placed the combat boots 20 years ago when she first arrived at Valley Memorial, when she was trying to become someone else, someone smaller, someone who could hide in plain sight. She opened it and looked at the shelves, her stethoscope coiled like a snake, 3 textbooks she'd bought but never opened because she already knew what they said, a photo of Tyler at 6 years old holding a basketball, her credentials in a plastic sleeve. She placed them all in a cardboard box. The stethoscope first. The photo. And at the bottom, the combat boots from Korengal, still holding the dust of that valley in their creases and seams. She'd never washed them. A small rebellion. A reminder in the sole of her feet. The security guard at the lobby desk was the same one who had scanned her badge yesterday, a young man named Patterson who always said good morning. He walked her to her truck without conversation. She could feel other eyes, nurses in doorways, orderlies in the break room, people she had worked beside for 2 decades, all of them suddenly very interested in their phones, their clipboards, anything but her face. The box sat in the passenger seat beside her as she drove. No destination. Just away. The highway opened up into the pre-dawn dark and she followed it until the hospital was far enough behind her that it became just another building against the skyline, then just a memory, then just a thing that had happened to someone else. The diner was open 24 hours on the edge of a strip mall outside San Antonio, the kind of place that existed in perpetual fluorescent noon. She sat in a booth and ordered coffee that tasted like it had been brewed before she arrived at Valley Memorial. The waitress refilled it without asking. It went cold. Margaret stared into the black surface and saw her face reflected there, a ghost in the glass, hollow-eyed and hollow everything. Her phone buzzed. A text from Tyler, "Mom, where are you? Call me." She silenced it. The reflection in the window was someone else's. Valkyrie. The name itself was a blade. The Norse goddess of the dead, the one who chose which warriors would fall, which would live, which would be carried to Valhalla. She had pulled an 8-year-old screaming from under concrete and told him he would grow up. She had kept him alive through infection and shrapnel and the kind of fear that lives in children's eyes. She had delivered him to a future. And the future had just fired her. The coffee had been cold for 20 minutes. The clock above the counter read 3:47 a.m. Outside, the parking lot was empty except for a semi-truck idling in the corner, waiting for its driver to finish a break. Everything smelled like burnt grease and the plastic of booths that had held 30 years of people passing through. The waitress had stopped refilling the coffee. Even she had the sense to leave Margaret alone. She had saved him twice, once from concrete, once from his own heart. And she had lost everything both times because the debt of that rescue never actually settled. It just compounded. It waited. The box sat on the passenger seat of her truck, visible through the diner window. Stethoscope. Photo. Boots. The inventory of 2 lives at once, the nurse she'd pretended to be and the soldier she'd actually been. Neither one had saved James Reeves. Both had failed him by existing in the same hospital at the same moment. Tomorrow, the hospital would issue a statement about the incident. Caldwell would control the narrative. The board would accept his recommendation. Her credentials would be questioned, her judgment impugned, her decisions reviewed by people who had never saved a life in the dark. By the time the sun rose over San Antonio, Margaret Walsh would be officially erased from Valley Memorial's roster. But she didn't know that the sun was about to bring something else with it. She didn't know that in 4 hours, her son would walk through Valley Memorial's lobby carrying a wooden case, that Reeves would whisper a code name into the silence of an ICU room, that uniforms would arrive in dress blues, that federal agents would carry tablets showing things that were classified, that every structure Caldwell had spent years building would collapse in the time it took to read a single citation. She only knew the coffee was cold and the reflection was a stranger and the boy she'd promised would grow up was safe now, even if she wasn't. Even if she never would be again. The emergency room doors burst open at 6:47 a.m., and security didn't even try to stop him. Tyler Walsh was 17, 6'2", and moving with the kind of single-minded purpose that made grown men step aside. He carried a wooden case, the kind that belonged in a museum or a locked attic, not a hospital corridor, and his eyes had that same flat intensity his mother had never quite learned to hide. The security guard at the front desk recognized him immediately. Same jaw. Same walk. The case looked heavy. He didn't slow down. Valley Memorial's morning shift had just begun settling into rhythm when Tyler hit the ICU like a door-breaching team. Nurses scattered. An orderly wheeling a medicine cart backed into an alcove. Nobody stopped a kid moving that purposefully through a restricted unit carrying something that old. He found the right room without asking. Captain James Reeves' ICU chamber. Margaret was inside, still there, hadn't gone home, hadn't slept, standing beside the monitor tracking Reeves' stabilizing vitals with the same clinical precision she'd shown for 18 years. Her scrubs were the same ones from the night shift. Her hands were steady. Tyler didn't knock. He stepped inside, let the door seal behind him, and set the wooden case on the visitor's chair like a man placing a detonation device. His voice came out quiet. "Mom, they need to see these. I don't care what you said about leaving it behind." The case smelled like old wood and dust and something else, something that didn't belong in a climate-controlled hospital. Margaret's hand stopped moving. She didn't turn around. The vital sign monitor beeped its steady rhythm. 68 beats per minute. Blood pressure holding at 121/74. The numbers of a man coming back from the edge. "Tyler," Margaret began, but her son had already opened the case. The sound it made was like a rifle breech closing. Deliberate. Final. The medals didn't catch the fluorescent light like metal should. They looked like they'd earned every shadow, every microfilm of dust, every year they'd spent in darkness. A silver star lay on burgundy ribbon. Next to it, a navy cross on white and gold ribbon, the kind that only comes home in a handful of cases each year. Below those, 2 purple hearts. The kind that don't come home at all because the people who earn them tend to stay where they fell. And under everything else, folded like a burial shroud, a dress uniform jacket with the insignia and rank still gleaming despite decades hidden away. The door opened at 6:59 a.m. without knocking. A Marine Corps liaison in dress blues moved with the certainty of a man who'd cleared more hostile rooms than most people had visited. He held a single document, 3 pages, stamped with classifications that made the air in the room feel different. Behind him came a 2-star general in Army service uniform, and the general didn't salute the protocol of the room or acknowledge Dr. Caldwell standing in the corner like a man watching his entire world convert to ash in real time. The general saluted the medals. Actually saluted them, fist to chest, the kind of salute that means you're honoring the dead or honoring the legend, and sometimes they're the same thing. The liaison's voice carried the weight of official documentation. Major Margaret Walsh, Silver Star, for extraordinary heroism under fire. Korengal Valley, 2003. Extracted 12 civilians, 3 children among them, under sustained insurgent fire spanning 43 minutes. Sustained 3 gunshot wounds. Refused evacuation until all civilians cleared the combat zone. He turned the page like he was reading scripture. Citation reads, "Without regard for her own life, Major Walsh exposed herself repeatedly to overwhelming enemy fire to provide medical aid and coordinate extraction operations, demonstrating valor above and beyond normal duty." He looked up from the document. His eyes found Margaret's face. "You were 24 years old." Dr. Caldwell opened his mouth. The 2-star general turned toward him with a kind of movement that made air molecules think about reorganizing themselves. "General Marcus Holloway, United States Army Central Command." The name landed like a boot sole on concrete. "You would be Dr. Pierce Caldwell. The man who just terminated a decorated military officer for performing emergency medical intervention that saved the life of a Special Forces captain." The general's voice didn't carry anger. It carried the kind of certainty that comes from having actually seen combat, from having actually watched people die because protocol mattered more than breathing. "That won't stand." Reeves opened his eyes in the ICU bed. When he saw the general, his monitor spiked, heart rate climbing from 72 to 84. Then he saw the medals. Then he saw Margaret's face. His eyes flooded, and he didn't try to hide it. Tears ran down his face like the rain ran down Korengal's canyon walls, and he was trying to sit up despite the monitor lines and the 4 drips and the recent surgical intervention that said don't. "Valkyrie," he whispered. Her code name came out like a prayer. Like someone who'd been holding it for 20 years finally exhaling. "You're Valkyrie." A Pentagon representative stepped forward, the kind of person who didn't have a name visible on her credentials, just a shield emblem and the bearing of someone accustomed to classified rooms. She held a tablet, and she tilted it toward Caldwell like she was serving him a subpoena. "Your hospital just terminated an active duty major without reviewing her personnel file. Specifically, her classified personnel file. which your clearance level is not high enough to access. She tapped the screen. Valkyrie. 37 confirmed operations. Tactical medical protocols developed by Major Walsh are currently taught at Fort Bragg. Her hand-to-hand combat technique, the same technique she just used in the ICU, is officially designated as a classified system. Your hospital fired a living legend, Dr. Caldwell, because she violated protocol. She violated protocol to save the life of a brother officer. Caldwell's face had gone the color of old drywall. His mouth was trying to form words that wouldn't come. He looked at the medals. He looked at the general. He looked at Margaret's hands, scarred hands, surgical hands, hands that had held 12 people together in a canyon valley while bullets carved through concrete and people screamed in Pashto and English and the universal language of terror. His voice came out strangled. This is inappropriate and changes nothing about her dismissal. The protocols are classified. The Pentagon representative didn't raise her voice. Quiet voices are more dangerous than loud ones. Which means you interfered with classified military operations when you attempted to discipline Major Walsh. Which means you may have committed a federal offense. The door opened again. The same security guard who'd handed Margaret her termination box yesterday stepped into the ICU room carrying an identical cardboard box. His name was Rodriguez, and he'd been working Valley Memorial security for 11 years, and he'd watched this woman come in before dawn for 2 decades without a single complaint or violation until she saved a man's life and a doctor decided that violated protocol. Rodriguez placed the box on the counter beside the vital sign monitor. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I believe you know the way out, sir. Your credentials have been revoked pending board review." Caldwell's hand shook as he reached for the box. Not the trembling of fear, but the trembling of a man whose entire architecture of authority had just collapsed in the time it takes to read a citation aloud. He walked out of the ICU room past a 2-star general and a Pentagon representative and a nurse in coffee-stained scrubs who didn't even look at him as he passed. The box was lighter than Margaret's had been. Same weight, maybe, but he moved like it was crushing him. The silence lasted 3 seconds. Then Captain James Reeves began to laugh, not with joy, but with the kind of laughter that comes from surviving something impossible twice. Once in a canyon valley. Once in an ICU room with monitors beeping like Morse code and a woman who refused to let him die either time. 6 months later, Margaret stood in front of a classroom at Lackland Air Force Base with the afternoon Texas sun slanting through reinforced glass. 23 combat medic candidates sat in front of her, notebooks open, eyes tracking her hands as she demonstrated the pericardiocentesis approach angle on a simulation torso. Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd actually done this under fire. Needle enters the xiphoid angle, 45 degrees. You feel the pericardium release. The hiss of air escaping means you've done it right. Blood output here, she indicated the collection tray, tells you how much time your patient has left. 90 seconds. Maybe less. Hesitation kills patients. When you know what needs to be done, and you have the training and the will, you do it. The consequences are always easier to survive than regret. A break in the lesson. 10 minutes. Margaret stepped toward the windows overlooking the supply depot parking lot. Her eyes found the medical supply van immediately, the one bearing unmarked insignia, the one that carried equipment to forward surgical teams and field hospitals. Dr. Pierce Caldwell stood beside it in civilian contractor uniform, unloading boxes with the careful precision of a man rebuilding from nothing. He looked older. Smaller. Like someone who'd spent 6 months learning what it felt like to be invisible, the way Margaret had spent 18 years learning the same lesson. She allowed herself the smallest smile. The kind of smile that contained 18 years and a canyon valley and a child's face transformed into a decorated officer. The kind of smile that wasn't for him, but for herself. Behind her, boots on tile. A uniform that didn't match, dress blues, not desert tan. Captain James Reeves walked into the classroom in full deployment regalia, cleared by cardiothoracic surgery, cleared by every protocol that mattered. He saluted her. She returned it. No words. The kind of silence that only exists between people who've held each other's lives in their hands. Tyler Walsh sat in the back row of the classroom, combat medic candidate number 14, taking notes on needle insertion angles with the focused intensity his mother recognized from her own mirror. When Margaret's eyes found his, he nodded. Not forgiveness. Not quite. But the beginning of understanding why she'd hidden what she was, and why hiding it was sometimes the only way to protect the people you loved from becoming targets. On Margaret's desk sat the worn combat boots from Korengal Valley, no longer hidden in a locker, no longer a secret to be ashamed of. They sat beside her medals, displayed openly, telling anyone who looked that the quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. The afternoon light caught the silver star and refused to let it go. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value, subscribe now and share this with someone who needs to remember that the world is full of legends in scrubs. Like the video. Comment below with your story. Because there are more Margarets out there than anyone realizes, and they need to know someone sees them.